Snow fell hard over Thornridge territory the night everything changed, and deep in the birthing den, a scream cut through the wind louder than the storm itself. Elena, mate of the Alpha, gripped the fur blankets beneath her, as pain rolled through her body in waves. Outside, the pack waited in silence, ears turned toward the den, hearts pounding with hope. A birth in the Alpha's line was never just a birth. It was a promise of strength for the whole pack, a new link in a chain that stretched back 100 years. The first cry came fast. A healthy pup, small and dark, slid into the world, and within 3 days, had already begun to show the telltale signs of the shift, whimpering and twitching in her sleep as her body learned the shape of a wolf. The pack rejoiced. Garrick, the Alpha, lifted his firstborn daughter high for all to see, and the pack howled together under the broken sky, a sound of triumph that rolled across the valley. But there had been 2 heartbeats in Elena's womb, not one, and the second child came differently. She was quiet where her sister had been loud. She did not whimper or twitch. She simply watched the world with wide, dark eyes that unsettled everyone who looked into them, even her own mother. The pack healer, an old woman named Agatha who had delivered nearly every child born to Thornridge in the last 4 decades, held the second baby a long moment before she spoke. "There is something different about this one," she said quietly, and no one in the den answered her, because they were all thinking the same thought and none of them wanted to be the first to say it aloud. They named her Arya, and for the first year of her life, she seemed like any other wolf pup might seem before the shift came. She crawled, she laughed, she chased her sister Wren around the den floor, biting at her tail in play. But months passed, then a full year, and Wren had already begun to shift small parts of herself, a claw here, a tuft of fur there, the earliest signs that her wolf was waking inside her. Arya showed nothing, no claws, no fur, no growl hiding beneath her baby laughter, just stillness, and eyes that seemed to see farther than a child her age should be able to see. Agatha watched her carefully during those months, more carefully than she watched any other pup in the pack, and she said nothing to Elena about what she suspected, because she was not yet certain, and because some truths are too heavy to hand to a mother before they are confirmed. The confirmation came on the night of the first snowfall of Arya's second winter. The pack had gathered near the great bonfire at the center of Thornridge territory, a tradition marking the changing of seasons, and children were allowed to stay up late to watch the flames dance against the dark. Arya sat close to the fire, wrapped in a fur blanket, watching the sparks rise into the black sky. Then, without warning, without the whimpering or twitching that always came before a wolf pup's first shift, her small body began to change. Her arms did not become paws, her spine did not lengthen into the shape of a wolf's back. Instead, her skin rippled and darkened, and where a child had been sitting a moment before, a small black bird now stood on unsteady legs, wings half spread, feathers slick and new. A raven born into a den of wolves, hatched from a body that had never laid an egg, shifted from a girl who had been running on 2 legs only seconds earlier. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Mothers pulled their children back. Warriors reached for weapons out of pure instinct before catching themselves, ashamed, uncertain what threat a small black bird could possibly pose, yet unable to shake the fear crawling up their spines. Elena rushed forward and gathered the raven form of her daughter into her arms, sobbing, whispering her name over and over as though saying it enough times might shift her back into something the pack could understand. Garrick stood frozen at the edge of the firelight, his face carved from stone, his mind racing through every story he had ever heard from his own father and grandfather, about the old ways, about the strange births that sometimes came to wolf packs, about signs that were said to change the fate of entire bloodlines. He had never believed those stories were anything more than tales meant to frighten young pups into good behavior. Now, watching his daughter's small black wings tremble in the firelight, he was no longer so certain. By morning, word had already begun to spread through Thornridge, whispered from den to den, faster than any messenger could have carried it. A raven born to wolves. Some called it a curse. Others, in hushed voices behind closed doors, called it something else entirely. A word too old and too heavy to say out loud in daylight. Prophecy. Agatha came to see Garrick and Elena before the sun had fully risen, her face grim, her steps slow with the weight of what she had to say. She had known this day might come since the moment she held Arya as a newborn, and she had spent the following months searching her memory for every old story her own grandmother had once told her about wolf-born ravens. Stories she had dismissed as legend, until she saw the truth sitting quietly in a bassinet with eyes too old for its face. "There is an old telling," Agatha said, settling herself by the fire inside the Alpha's den, "that once in many generations, a child is born to wolves, who does not become a wolf at all. This child becomes something else, something with wings, dark as midnight, sharp of eye. The old stories say this child will one day stand at the center of the greatest danger our kind has ever faced, and that the fate of every pack in the north will rest on what this child chooses to do." Elena held Arya close against her chest, the girl having shifted back into her small human form sometime before dawn, sleeping peacefully now, as though the events of the previous night had never happened. Elena's arms tightened protectively. "She is a baby," Elena said, her voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. "She is not a weapon, she is not a sign, she is my daughter." Agatha nodded slowly, understanding the fear behind the words, having raised children of her own long ago, and knowing exactly what it felt like to want to shield a child from a fate too large for small shoulders to carry. "I am not saying what she is meant to become," Agatha said gently. "I am saying what others will believe about her, whether we wish it or not. Word of a raven born to wolves will travel. It always does, and there will be those who come looking, some with kindness in their hearts, and others without." Garrick listened to every word, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his sleeping daughter. He thought of the neighboring packs, the alliances built on trust and blood over generations, the rivalries that simmered beneath polite words exchanged at gatherings. He thought of the Frostmane territory far to the north, ruled by a young alpha king whose reputation for strength and cunning had already reached even the southern packs. If word of Arya reached ears like that, there was no telling what might follow. "We will keep this quiet," Garrick said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision he knew could not be easily undone. "No one outside Thornridge learns what she is. She will be raised as any other pup. She will learn to hide the shift, until we understand what it means, and what threat, if any, might come looking for her." Agatha agreed, though the look in her eyes suggested she doubted a secret this large could stay buried forever. Secrets involving prophecy rarely did, not in a world where every pack watched its neighbors for weakness and opportunity in equal measure. Over the following days, the pack settled into an uneasy quiet. Those who had witnessed the shift by the bonfire were sworn to silence, some out of loyalty to their alpha, others out of genuine fear of what speaking the truth aloud might invite. Children who had seen the small black bird were told it had been a trick of firelight and shadow, a story most were too young to question, though a few older pups exchanged knowing glances that suggested they were not entirely convinced. Ren, Arya's twin sister, was too young to understand what had happened, but she seemed to sense that something had shifted in the way the pack looked at her sister. Where before the two girls had been treated as a matched pair, two halves of the same promise born to the Alpha's line, now the pack's attention bent almost entirely toward Ren, the daughter who had shifted correctly, the daughter who fit neatly into the story everyone already understood. Arya, though no one said it aloud in her presence, began to exist at the edges of things, present but somehow set apart, watched but rarely approached. Elena noticed this shift in treatment before anyone else did, and it broke something in her that she never fully repaired. She began spending long hours alone with Arya, teaching her small games, singing to her at night, trying desperately to give her daughter a childhood untouched by the fear the rest of the pack could not quite hide. But children are perceptive in ways adults often forget, and even as a toddler, Arya seemed to understand, in some wordless way, that she was different, that the warmth other pups received without question came to her only in careful, guarded portions. By the time Arya was old enough to walk steadily on her own 2 feet, she had already learned to read the room the way older, more experienced wolves might read the wind for danger. She noticed which pack members smiled easily at her, and which ones offered only polite, distant nods. She noticed how Ren was pulled into games with other pups, while she herself was often left standing at the edge of the play, watching, always watching, the same way she had watched the fire on the night of her first shift. Agatha continued to visit the den regularly, not just as the pack healer, but as something closer to a guardian of the secret itself. She began teaching Elena small techniques to help Arya control the shift, breathing patterns, and quiet words meant to calm a young mind, before the change could take hold unexpectedly. It was slow, careful work, made harder by the fact that no one in Thornridge, not even Agatha with all her decades of knowledge, truly understood how a raven shift functioned inside a body built for wolves. Meanwhile, far beyond the borders of Thorn Ridge, in territories neither Garrick nor Elena had any reason to think of, whispers of the storm on the night of the first snowfall had already begun their long journey outward, carried by traveling merchants, by wandering pack members visiting distant relatives, by the kind of gossip that no wall or secret oath could fully contain. A story that strange, about a wolf pack birthing a bird where a wolf should have been, was simply too remarkable for anyone who heard it to keep entirely to themselves. It would be years before that whisper reached ears capable of understanding its true weight, years during which Arya would grow from a watchful toddler into a girl caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. But the whisper was already moving, drifting north on the same winds that had carried the first snowfall over Thornridge, carrying with it the earliest thread of a story that would one day pull Arya far from everything she had ever known, into a fate neither she nor her parents could yet imagine, and toward a king who was already, in quiet moments, listening for exactly this kind of story to reach him. The first time Arya almost gave herself away, she was 5 years old, and the memory of that afternoon stayed with Agatha for the rest of her life, a reminder of how thin the wall really was between the secret they had built and the disaster waiting on the other side of it. A trading party from a neighboring pack had arrived at Thornridge to exchange goods, before the winter months made travel difficult, and Garrick had welcomed them with the careful hospitality expected between allied territories. Children from both packs were allowed to play together near the eastern fields while the adults conducted their business, and Arya, caught up in a game of chase with a group of pups her own age, tripped over an exposed root and fell hard against the frozen ground. Pain has a way of breaking through even the most careful training, and for one terrifying heartbeat, Arya's control slipped. Her fingers began to darken at the tips, the first sign of feathers threatening to break through skin. A visiting pup, quick-eyed and curious, stared at her hand with open confusion, and might have said something to the wrong person had Ren not appeared at that exact moment, grabbing her sister's arm and pulling her upright with practiced speed. Arya fell funny, that is all, Ren said loudly, laughing in a way that drew attention away from her sister's hand and toward her own performance instead. Come on, clumsy, let us go get you cleaned up before you scare the visitors with your terrible balance. The other children laughed, the moment passed, and by the time Agatha reached the field, alerted by a quiet word from a nearby warrior who had noticed something strange, Arya's fingers had already returned to their normal shape, but the fear in Agatha's chest that day never fully left her. She understood then, more clearly than ever, that raising Arya in secret would require constant vigilance, not just from the adults who already knew the truth, but from the girl herself, and from anyone else clever enough to notice small inconsistencies. That evening, Agatha sat with Arya in the healer's den, away from the noise of the pack, and began teaching her something she called the quiet breath, a technique meant to help a young mind find calm, even when pain or fear threatened to break it apart. Close your eyes, Agatha told her, and picture a still lake at dawn. No wind, no ripples, nothing moving at all. When you feel the change trying to come without your permission, find that lake inside yourself and sit beside it until the feeling passes. Arya practiced this technique for months, sitting quietly in corners of the den, eyes closed, small chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate rhythm. It worked, more often than not, though there were still nights when nightmares broke through her control, and Elena would wake to find a small black bird tangled in the blankets instead of her daughter, wings beating in panic, until Elena's soft voice and gentle hands coaxed the shift back into its human shape. As the years passed, Arya grew skilled at a particular kind of quiet, a watchfulness that made her seem older than her age, an observer standing slightly apart from every gathering, every game, every celebration the pack held. She learned to laugh at the right moments and speak the right words, performing a version of belonging even when she felt none of it settle into her bones. Ren, meanwhile, blossomed into everything a young wolf was expected to become, quick and strong, well-liked among the other pups, already showing signs of leadership that made Garrick's chest swell with pride whenever he watched her. The difference between the sisters became sharper with each passing year, though Ren herself never treated Arya as anything less than an equal. If anything, Ren seemed to sense the isolation her sister carried, and worked harder than anyone else in the pack to close the distance between them, inventing games only the two of them played, sharing secrets meant for no one else, defending Arya fiercely whenever another pup made an unkind comment about her quiet nature, or her habit of staring too long at the sky. "Why do you always look up like that?" Ren asked her once, when they were perhaps 7 years old, lying on their backs in a meadow outside the den, watching clouds drift overhead. "I do not know," Arya answered honestly, because she truly did not understand the pull she felt whenever she looked toward open sky, a longing that lived somewhere beneath her ribs, patient and constant, waiting for a moment when she might finally answer it. Agatha noticed this longing too, and it worried her more than anything else about Arya's condition. A wolf pup who felt out of place might still find belonging eventually, might grow into a role within the pack even if it took time. But a girl who looked at open sky with that particular kind of hunger in her eyes was a girl who might one day choose to leave, prophecy or no prophecy, and Agatha understood that no amount of careful training could keep a creature built for flight forever tethered to solid ground. The forbidden northern woods bordering Thornridge territory became a frequent topic of warning throughout Arya's childhood, spoken of by every adult in the pack as a place too dangerous for young pups to wander, home to old magic and unpredictable dangers that had claimed careless travelers in generations past. Garrick had marked its boundary clearly, forbidding any pack member, young or old, from crossing into its shadowed tree line without explicit permission. For most pups, the warning was enough to keep them away entirely, the woods becoming little more than a dark shape at the edge of childhood imagination, a place mentioned in cautionary stories told around evening fires. For Arya, the warning had the opposite effect. She found herself drawn to the edge of those woods more and more often as she grew older, standing at the tree line during quiet afternoons, when the rest of the pack was occupied elsewhere, watching the way light fell differently beneath those particular branches, feeling something in the air that felt less like danger and more like recognition, as though some part of her understood that place in a way she could not yet explain. She never crossed the boundary during those early years, held back by respect for her father's rule and by Agatha's constant reminders of the importance of caution. But the pull remained, growing stronger with each passing season, until it became one more secret Arya carried quietly inside herself, alongside the shift she hid from outsiders, and the loneliness she rarely spoke of even to Ren. By the time Arya turned 10, the pack had largely settled into an unspoken agreement never to discuss the events of that first snowfall directly, though the memory lived on in careful glances and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Arya entered a room. She had grown skilled enough at controlling her shift that incidents like the one during the trading visit became rare, though never entirely absent. Agatha continued her lessons, expanding them to include not just control of the shift itself, but knowledge of what little history existed about raven shifters born among wolves, fragments gathered from old texts, and older memories passed down through generations of healers before her. "The old stories agree on very little," Agatha told her during one such lesson, sitting together in the healer's den, surrounded by worn scrolls and carefully preserved journals. "Some say the raven shifter is meant to be a bridge between worlds that were never meant to touch. Others say the raven shifter exists to see what wolves cannot see, to notice danger from angles no ground-bound creature could ever observe. What they all agree on, without exception, is that when a raven is born to wolves, something significant is coming, something that will test the strength of every pack touched by the prophecy." "What kind of something?" Arya asked, and Agatha, for perhaps the first time in all their years together, admitted that she did not know, that the old texts spoke only in riddles and half-remembered warnings, that whatever threat the prophecy referred to had not manifested in living memory, if it had manifested at all, in the centuries since the stories first began circulating among wolf packs of the north. This uncertainty settled uneasily in Arya's chest, a weight she carried alongside everything else, and though she continued her lessons and continued performing the quiet version of belonging she had perfected over years of practice, something inside her had begun to shift, in a way that had nothing to do with feathers or wings. She began to understand, slowly and without anyone telling her directly, that whatever waited for her beyond the borders of Thornridge, whatever the prophecy truly meant, she would eventually have to face it, not as the wolf pup the pack had once expected her to become, but as exactly what she was, strange and singular, and unlike anyone else in her world. It was during this same year, as autumn turned the meadows gold, and the first cold winds began sweeping down from the northern mountains, that Arya first heard the name that would, though she could not have known it then, come to define the rest of her life. A traveling merchant, sharing news over the evening fire with a small circle of Thornridge warriors, mentioned in passing the growing reputation of the young Alpha King who now ruled Frostmane territory, a leader whose strength in battle was matched only by his uncanny ability to gather information others believed impossible to obtain. "They say he knows things before anyone tells him," the merchant said, shaking his head in a mixture of admiration and unease. "Rumors reach that king faster than they reach anyone else in the north. Some say he has ravens of his own, scattered across every territory, watching, listening, carrying word back to Frostmane on silent wings." Arya, sitting quietly at the edge of the fire, where she often positioned herself during evening gatherings, felt something cold settle in her stomach at those words, though she could not have explained why a stranger's reputation, spoken of in an offhand comment by a passing merchant, would matter to a girl who had never once left the borders of her own territory. She told herself it was nothing, a passing chill brought on by the changing season, and pushed the feeling aside, as she had learned to push aside so many things over the years. But the name stayed with her regardless, tucked away in some quiet corner of her memory, waiting for the day when it would surface again, carried this time not by a stranger's idle gossip beside a dying fire, but by the man himself, arriving at her territory's border, with purpose in his eyes, and the weight of an ancient prophecy resting heavily on his shoulders. By the time Arya turned 16, the careful girl who once practiced quiet breathing in the corner of a healer's den had grown into someone far more restless, someone whose control over her shift had become so complete that even Agatha sometimes forgot, for whole days at a time, that there was anything unusual about her at all. But control over the body is not the same as peace within the heart, and Arya's heart, that particular autumn, had begun to ache with a longing she no longer had the patience to ignore. The Forbidden Woods still stood at the northern edge of Thornridge territory, their tree line dark and unwelcoming against the pale evening sky, and Garrick's rule against crossing that boundary had never once been lifted in all the years since Arya first felt its strange pull as a small child. She had spent a decade standing at its edge, watching, wondering, holding herself back out of respect and fear in equal measure. But respect and fear, she had come to realize, could only hold a person for so long, before something inside them finally broke free. The night she crossed the boundary for the first time began like any other. The pack had gathered for a late autumn feast, celebrating a successful hunting season before the harshest months of winter arrived, and the noise and warmth of the gathering pressed in around Arya, until she felt she could hardly breathe. Ren, now fully grown into her role as one of the pack's most promising young warriors, was surrounded by admirers and friends, laughing loudly at some story a fellow wolf was telling, entirely at ease, in a way Arya had never quite managed despite years of practice. Arya slipped away from the fire without announcing her departure, something she had done countless times before, and no one thought much of it, assuming she simply needed a quiet moment away from the noise, as she often did. But this time, instead of walking the familiar paths near the den, her feet carried her steadily northward, past the last torchlight of the gathering, past the outer watchposts, where tired warriors nodded to her without concern, straight toward the dark tree line that had haunted her thoughts for as long as she could remember. She stood at the boundary for a long moment, the cold night air biting at her skin, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation she had never quite felt before. Somewhere behind her, faint and distant, the sounds of the feast continued, laughter and music carried on the wind. Ahead of her, the woods waited in silence, their shadows deep enough to swallow the last of the moonlight. She stepped across the boundary before she allowed herself to think too hard about the decision, and the moment her foot touched the ground on the forbidden side of the line, something inside her chest loosened, as though a knot she had carried for 16 years had finally begun to untangle. The air here felt different, charged in a way she could not name, thick with an energy that made the fine hairs on her arms rise. She walked slowly at first, cautious, listening for any sign of the dangers her father had always warned about. But the woods remained quiet, patient, almost welcoming, in a way that contradicted every warning she had ever received. She found a small clearing, perhaps a quarter-mile past the boundary, ringed by tall pines, that opened onto a wide patch of clear night sky, thick with stars. Standing there, surrounded by silence and darkness, Arya felt the shift begin to rise inside her. Not the careful, controlled transformation she had practiced for years under Agatha's watchful guidance, but something wilder, something that wanted to happen rather than needing to be summoned. She let it come. Her body darkened and shrank, her arms folding into wings, her vision sharpening in the particular way it always did when she took her raven form, colors deepening, distances collapsing, every rustle of leaf and creak of branch suddenly audible with startling clarity. She spread her wings, feeling the cold night air catch beneath them, and for the first time in her life, she did not hold back. She launched herself upward with a single powerful beat of her wings, rising above the clearing, above the tree line, into open sky thick with stars, and framed by the pale curve of a rising moon. The feeling that swept through her in that moment defied every word she might have used to describe it. Freedom, perhaps, though the word felt too small for what she experienced. A sensation of rightness so complete that tears might have come to her eyes, had she still possessed eyes capable of producing them in this form. She flew for what felt like only minutes, but must have been much longer, tracing wide circles above the forbidden woods, diving low over the treetops, before climbing again into open sky, testing the limits of speed and grace her wings could offer her. She had flown before, in small, careful bursts within the boundaries of Thornridge territory, always watching for observers, always ready to drop back into her human form the moment anyone might notice. But this, flying without restraint above a landscape she had never before seen from such a height, felt entirely different. Felt like discovering a part of herself she had spent 16 years keeping carefully locked away. She did not notice, at first, the figure standing at the edge of a distant ridge, watching her flight with careful, calculating eyes. He had been traveling through the borderlands for nearly a week, a scout in service to Frostmane territory far to the north, sent south on a routine mission to gather information about neighboring packs and report back anything unusual to his king. His name was Finn, young for a scout, but sharp-eyed and patient, well-suited to work that required long hours of silent observation. He had heard the old rumors about a raven born to wolves years earlier, passed along in whispered stories at trading posts and border crossings, stories most scouts dismissed as exaggerated gossip unworthy of serious attention. Finn, however, had learned early in his career never to dismiss anything entirely, and when he spotted movement in the night sky above the forbidden woods bordering Thornridge territory, movement that resolved itself into the unmistakable shape of a large black bird, flying with a grace and freedom no ordinary raven could match, he understood immediately that he had stumbled upon something far more significant than a routine border patrol. He watched from his ridge for nearly an hour, careful to remain hidden among the rocks and low brush, tracking the bird's flight pattern, noting the way it moved with a purpose and joy that felt almost human in its expression. When the bird finally descended back into the clearing below, and, moments later, a young woman emerged from the tree line, walking calmly back toward Thornridge territory, Finn understood without any doubt that the old rumors had been true all along. He did not approach her. His orders, drilled into him since his earliest days of training, were clear regarding situations of this significance. Observe, report. Never engage without explicit instruction from higher authority. He watched Arya disappear back across the boundary into Thornridge territory, memorizing every detail of her appearance, her height, the color of her hair, the particular way she walked with her shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to make herself smaller than she truly was. Then he turned and began the long journey north, moving through the night with the practiced efficiency of a scout who understood that some information could not wait for morning light. Arya, unaware of the eyes that had witnessed her first true flight, returned to Thornridge territory, feeling lighter than she had in years, the weight of a decade of careful restraint finally beginning to ease. She slipped back into the feast just as it was winding down, and if anyone noticed her prolonged absence, they said nothing of it, assuming she had simply needed time alone as she often did. But the taste of freedom, once experienced, is not easily forgotten, and over the following weeks, Arya found herself returning to the forbidden woods again and again, drawn by the same pull that had first led her across the boundary, unable to resist the call of open sky, now that she finally understood what it felt like to answer it fully. She grew careless in small ways, staying longer than she should, flying farther from the clearing than was strictly wise, trusting in the isolation of the borderlands to keep her secret safe from discovery. She did not know that Finn had already reported everything he witnessed to his superiors within Frostmane territory, that his account had traveled quickly through the proper channels until it reached the ears of the one person in the entire Northern Territories capable of understanding its full significance. She did not know that her name, though Finn had never learned it, had already become the subject of careful discussion in a fortress far to the north, or that plans were already being made regarding how best to approach the situation without causing alarm among the wolves of Thornridge. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she had found a place where she felt entirely herself, a stretch of forbidden sky, above forbidden woods, where the girl who never quite fit among wolves could finally become exactly what she was always meant to be. She did not yet understand that this same freedom, this same quiet joy she had discovered in solitary flight, was about to draw the attention of a king whose interest in her would change the course of her life forever, pulling her away from everything familiar and toward a destiny far larger and far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined during her long years of careful, hidden waiting. Frostmane territory sat at the far northern edge of the Wolflands, a stretch of mountains and pine forest so cold that even seasoned warriors wrapped themselves in thick furs from the first frost until the last snow melted, sometimes for more than half the year. The pack that ruled this harsh land had earned a reputation across every southern territory for discipline and strength, qualities embodied most completely in their young alpha king, a wolf named Draven who had claimed leadership of Frostmane before his 25th birthday and had held it without serious challenge ever since. Draven had not been born to easy power. His father, the previous alpha, had died suddenly during a particularly brutal winter, leaving behind a territory vulnerable to challenge from ambitious rivals both within the pack and beyond its borders. Draven, barely old enough to be considered a full warrior at the time, had been forced to prove himself through trial after trial, defeating stronger and more experienced wolves in contests that should, by all reasonable expectation, have ended in his defeat. He won each challenge not through raw strength alone, though he possessed plenty of that, but through a particular kind of patience and cunning that allowed him to study his opponents carefully before ever entering combat, learning their weaknesses long before the fight itself began. This same patience had shaped the way Draven ruled once his position as Alpha King was secure. Rather than relying solely on strength to maintain order, he had built an extensive network of scouts and informants, stretching across nearly every territory in the north. Wolves loyal to Frostmane who traveled quietly through neighboring lands, gathering information about rival packs, potential threats, and shifting alliances long before such information became common knowledge elsewhere. It was this network, carefully built over years of patient investment, that had allowed rumors of the wolf-born Raven to eventually reach him at all. Rumors that had circulated in whispered form for over a decade, before Finn's direct sighting finally confirmed what had previously existed only as unverified legend. Draven received Finn's report in his private chamber late one evening, the young scout having traveled through 3 days and nights without proper rest to deliver the news personally, rather than trusting it to a relay messenger. Draven listened without interruption as Finn described everything he had witnessed, the graceful flight above the forbidden woods, the transformation from bird to young woman, the careful way she had returned to Thornridge territory, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. When Finn finished speaking, Draven remained silent for a long moment, staring into the fire burning low in his chamber's hearth, his expression unreadable, in the way that had become legendary among those who served him. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the particular weight it always held when he considered a matter of true significance. "You are certain of what you saw?" Draven asked, though his tone made clear he already believed the answer. "Completely certain," Finn confirmed. "I have never seen a bird fly the way she flew, my king. There was something in it that felt more than instinct. It felt like choice, like joy. No ordinary raven moves through the sky that way." Draven had heard the old stories of the wolf-born raven since childhood, tales told to him by his own grandmother during long winter evenings, when the wind howled too fiercely outside for anyone to venture beyond the fortress walls. His grandmother, a woman who had served as Frostmane's healer for decades before her passing, had taken the old prophecies more seriously than most, having studied ancient texts that predated even the oldest memories held by the current generation of pack elders. She had told Draven, more than once, that if such a creature were ever truly born, It would signal the approach of a danger, unlike anything the northern packs had faced in living memory. A threat sealed away long ago, in a place few dared speak of directly. A cursed borderland, known throughout the north as the Veiled Wilds. Draven had grown up hearing warnings about the Veiled Wilds, the way other children heard warnings about wandering too far from home after dark. Treated as little more than a story, meant to keep young pups obedient and cautious. But his grandmother had insisted, with a seriousness that stayed with him long after her death, that the Veiled Wilds represented a genuine and growing danger. An ancient entity bound within its borders by wards that grew weaker with each passing generation. Wards that would eventually fail entirely, unless the proper conditions arose to renew them, or eliminate the threat permanently. Only a raven born to wolves can walk that path safely, his grandmother had told him, during one of their final conversations before her passing. The wards recognize wolf blood as a threat, and will destroy any wolf who attempts to cross them, no matter how skilled or careful that wolf might be. But a raven, especially a raven who carries wolf blood within her, moves differently through that kind of magic. She becomes something the wards cannot properly categorize, something neither fully wolf nor fully bird, and in that confusion, she may find passage where no wolf ever could. Draven had carried these words with him for years, never quite certain whether he believed them fully, or simply respected his grandmother enough to keep them stored carefully in memory, rather than dismissing them entirely. Finn's report changed that uncertainty into something closer to conviction. If a raven had truly been born to wolves within Thornridge territory, the old prophecy his grandmother had warned him about was no longer merely a story passed down through generations of careful storytelling. It had become a living, breathing possibility, walking somewhere in the borderlands to the south, entirely unaware of the role she might be destined to play in preventing a catastrophe that could destroy every pack in the northern territories. Draven spent the following days in careful consultation with his most trusted advisors, a small circle of wolves who had served Frostmane for years and understood the delicate nature of approaching a matter this significant without causing alarm or provoking unnecessary conflict with a neighboring territory. Thornridge had never been an enemy of Frostmane, their relationship existing in the careful neutrality common between packs that shared no direct border disputes but also shared no particular alliance beyond basic diplomatic courtesy. Approaching Garrick directly about his own daughter, about a secret the Thornridge Alpha had clearly worked hard to protect for 16 years, required a delicacy that Draven understood could not be entrusted to scouts or messengers alone. "I will go myself," Draven announced during one such consultation, drawing immediate concern from several of his advisors who worried openly about the wisdom of their king traveling personally into another pack's territory over a matter this sensitive. "My king," one advisor said carefully, "if Thornridge has kept this secret for 16 years, they will not welcome an outsider arriving to expose it. Even an outsider who comes with peaceful intentions. There is risk in this approach, risk to your safety, and risk to relations between our territories." Draven considered this warning seriously, weighing it against everything his grandmother had taught him about the urgency of the situation, against the growing sense within his own chest that time might be more limited than any of them currently understood. The wards around the Veiled Wilds had been weakening gradually for generations, according to every account he had ever heard, and if the Raven prophecy had finally manifested after so many decades of waiting, it likely meant the wards had grown weak enough that the ancient threat within those cursed lands might soon stir from whatever long sleep had kept it contained. "If I send scouts or messengers alone," Draven finally responded, "Garrick will have every reason to distrust their intentions, to assume Frostmane seeks to exploit or threaten his daughter for our own advantage. But if I go myself, if I speak with him directly, and explain the true stakes involved, there is at least a chance he will understand that I come seeking cooperation, rather than conquest. This is not a matter that concerns only Thornridge, or only Frostmane. If the Veiled Wilds threat truly awakens, every pack in the north will suffer the consequences, regardless of territory or allegiance." His advisors, though still uneasy, eventually accepted the wisdom in this reasoning, understanding that a king who ruled through patience and careful strategy, rather than blind aggression, had earned the right to make difficult decisions according to his own judgment. Preparations began quickly. A small traveling party assembled to accompany Draven southward, chosen carefully for discretion and loyalty rather than sheer numbers, since Draven understood that arriving with anything resembling an army would immediately transform a delicate diplomatic mission into something that looked far more like a threat or invasion. Finn was included among those chosen to accompany the king south, given his first-hand knowledge of the territory and his direct experience witnessing Arya's flight above the Forbidden Woods. The young scout felt a mixture of pride and nervousness at being selected for such an important mission, understanding that whatever happened during this journey would likely be remembered for generations within Frostmane's history, one way or another. The journey south took nearly a week, traveling through terrain that gradually softened from the harsh mountain slopes of Frostmane territory into gentler hills and forests as they approached the borders of Thornridge land. Draven spent much of the journey in quiet reflection, running through countless possible approaches to his conversation with Garrick, aware that the wrong words spoken at the wrong moment could destroy any chance of cooperation before the conversation had properly begun. He thought often of his grandmother's warnings about the Veiled Wilds, of the responsibility he now carried not just for his own territory, but potentially for every pack across the northern lands, and of the young woman he had never met, but whose entire fate, according to prophecies older than any living memory, might already be intertwined with his own. By the time Draven's small traveling party crested the final ridge overlooking Thornridge territory, the autumn sky had begun to darken toward evening, painting the valley below in shades of gold and deepening blue. Draven paused there for a long moment, studying the peaceful scene spread out before him, dens and gathering grounds nestled among familiar hills, entirely unaware of the significance about to arrive at their borders. Somewhere within that valley, a girl who had spent her entire life hiding a secret was going about whatever ordinary evening activities occupied her attention, entirely unaware that her carefully guarded existence was about to be irrevocably changed by the arrival of a king who already knew far more about her true nature than she could possibly imagine. Draven took a steadying breath, signaled his party forward, and began the final descent toward Thornridge territory, carrying with him not just the weight of his own kingdom's future, but the fate of every pack that called the northern lands home, all of it now resting on the outcome of a conversation he had not yet had the chance to begin. Word that a stranger approached the border reached Garrick within minutes, carried by a breathless young warrior who had been standing watch near the eastern ridge. A group of 6 travelers, the warrior reported, moving with clear purpose down the main path toward Thornridge territory, their leader wearing markings that identified him unmistakably as royalty from Frostmane. Garrick felt his stomach tighten at the news, some instinct deep within him, already suspecting, though he could not yet explain why, that this visit had nothing to do with ordinary diplomatic courtesy. He gathered a small group of his most trusted warriors and went personally to meet the approaching party at the territory boundary, arriving just as Draven and his companions crested the final hill separating the two lands. The two leaders studied each other for a long moment across the boundary line, each taking measure of the other in the careful, silent way that leaders of rival territories always did upon their first meeting. "Draven," Garrick said finally, his voice carrying polite formality that did nothing to disguise the wariness underneath it. "This is an unexpected visit. Frostmane and Thornridge have exchanged few words in recent years, beyond the necessary courtesies at seasonal gatherings. I understand this arrival is unusual," Draven replied, his tone measured and respectful, the tone of a leader who understood the importance of choosing his opening words with great care. "I would not have made this journey myself, leaving my own territory during a season when a king's presence is often needed at home, unless the matter I came to discuss was of the gravest importance." Garrick studied him carefully, noting the small size of his traveling party, the absence of any obvious weapons of aggression, the calm patience in Draven's posture that suggested a man prepared for a long and careful conversation rather than a sudden confrontation. Whatever business had brought the Alpha King of Frostmane to his border, it clearly was not the kind of business that called for immediate conflict. "Then let us speak somewhere private," Garrick said finally, gesturing for Draven and a single companion to follow him, while the rest of both parties remained at a respectful distance near the boundary. "Whatever you have traveled so far to discuss, I suspect it is not meant for every ear in my territory to hear." They walked together toward Garrick's den, tension coiled tight between them despite the outward appearance of calm cooperation, and once inside, away from watching eyes and listening ears, Draven finally allowed himself to speak the words he had rehearsed countless times during the long journey south. "I have come to speak with you about your daughter," Draven said, watching carefully for Garrick's reaction. Not the daughter who trains as a warrior among your pack, admirable as her progress surely is. I have come to speak of your other daughter, the one who was born something other than wolf. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Garrick had experienced in 16 years of careful secrecy. His face remained carefully neutral through years of practiced leadership, but something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of fear and fury combined into an expression that made even Draven, confident as he was in his approach, feel a moment of genuine unease. I do not know what stories you have heard, Garrick said slowly, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that Draven recognized immediately as the voice of a father prepared to defend his child against any perceived threat, regardless of the cost to himself. But whatever rumor has reached your territory, you would be wise to forget it entirely, and never speak of it again. I understand your instinct to protect her, Draven replied, keeping his own voice steady, despite the tension building rapidly in the small space between them. I would feel exactly the same if our positions were reversed. But I have not come here to expose your daughter or threaten her safety in any way. I have come because I believe her existence signals a danger that threatens every pack in the Northern Territories, including my own, including yours, and I believe she may be the only one capable of preventing that danger from destroying us all. Garrick's expression did not soften, but something in his posture shifted slightly, curiosity beginning to war with his protective instincts, despite his obvious desire to dismiss Draven's words entirely and send him back north without further discussion. Explain yourself, Garrick said finally, the words clipped and cautious. Draven spent the following hour recounting everything his grandmother had taught him about the Veiled Wilds, about the ancient entity sealed within its cursed borders generations ago, about the wards that had protected the Northern Territories from that entity's influence for as long as anyone could remember, wards that had grown steadily weaker with each passing generation, according to every account he had ever studied. He explained the old prophecy regarding a raven born to wolves, the belief that such a creature alone could safely cross the wards that would destroy any ordinary wolf who attempted the same journey, and the growing concern within his own advisors that the wards might be approaching complete failure, given how much time had passed since the prophecy was first recorded. Garrick listened without interruption, his expression gradually shifting from suspicion toward something closer to grim consideration as Draven's explanation continued. He had heard fragments of these old stories himself over the years, dismissed mostly as legend meant to frighten young pups, but hearing them now, connected directly and deliberately to his own daughter's unusual birth, the pieces began arranging themselves into a pattern too significant to dismiss easily. Even if everything you say is true, Garrick said once Draven finished speaking, why would I send my own daughter into a cursed and dangerous land based on old stories neither of us can fully verify? What guarantee do I have that this is not simply an elaborate justification for taking her from her home and exploiting whatever unusual abilities she possesses for your own territory's benefit? You have no guarantee beyond my word, Draven admitted honestly, because he understood that false assurances would only damage whatever trust he hoped to build during this difficult conversation. But I did not come here to demand anything from you or from her. I came to share what I know, and to offer whatever support my own territory can provide, should you and your daughter choose to investigate this matter further. If the threat within the Veiled Wilds is real, ignoring it will not make it disappear. It will simply mean facing it later, likely with far less preparation and far less understanding of what we face than we might gather now, while there is still time to prepare properly. Garrick sat in silence for a long while after Draven finished speaking, weighing everything he had heard against 16 years of careful protection, against every instinct that told him to send this foreign king away and continue guarding his daughter's secret as he always had. But he was also a leader responsible for far more than just his own family, and something in Draven's careful, measured explanation carried a weight of sincerity that Garrick found difficult to dismiss entirely. I will not decide this for her, Garrick said finally, his voice heavy with a decision that felt both necessary and painful in equal measure. Whatever role this prophecy claims for her, it is her choice whether to accept it or reject it entirely. But I will allow you to speak with her directly, to explain what you have explained to me, and she alone will decide what happens next. He sent word for Arya to be brought to his den, and while they waited for her arrival, an uneasy quiet settled between the two leaders, each aware that the conversation about to unfold would likely determine the course of events for years to come, regardless of what Arya ultimately chose to do. Arya arrived confused and slightly anxious, having been summoned unexpectedly from an ordinary afternoon spent helping Agatha organize herbs in the healer's den. She had heard whispers already circulating through the territory about strangers arriving at the border, strangers wearing Frostmane markings, and some instinct deep within her chest had already begun to suspect, though she could not explain exactly why, that this visit somehow concerned her directly. When she entered her father's den and saw the unfamiliar wolf standing beside him, tall and composed with sharp, intelligent eyes that studied her with an intensity she had never experienced from a stranger before, she felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of fear and something she could not quite name, something closer to recognition than she expected to feel toward someone she had never met. "Arya," Garrick said, his voice carrying a gentleness she rarely heard him use even in private family moments. "This is Draven, Alpha King of Frostmane territory. He has traveled a great distance to speak with you about something important, something concerning your birth and the nature of your shift." Arya felt her stomach drop, 16 years of carefully guarded secrecy, suddenly feeling as fragile as spun glass in the face of this stranger's knowing gaze. She looked between her father and the unfamiliar king, searching for some sign of how she should respond, some indication of whether this moment represented the beginning of disaster or something else entirely, something she had no proper name for yet. Draven met her gaze steadily, and in that first extended look between them, something passed silently that neither of them could have easily put into words, a recognition perhaps, or the beginning of a connection that would grow to define the course of both their futures, in ways neither could yet fully understand. "I know what you are," Draven said quietly, his voice gentle despite the weight of the words themselves, "and I believe I know why you were born the way you were born. If you will allow me the chance to explain, I think you deserve to finally understand the true nature of the prophecy you have carried, unknowingly, your entire life." Arya sat across from Draven that evening, in a quiet corner of her father's den, the fire between them casting long shadows against the walls, while Garrick remained nearby, close enough to intervene should the conversation take a troubling turn, far enough to allow his daughter the space to hear this stranger's words and form her own judgment about them. "Tell me everything," Arya said, her voice steadier than she felt inside, years of practiced composure finally serving a purpose beyond simply hiding her shift from curious onlookers. Draven nodded and began speaking, his voice measured and careful, the voice of a leader accustomed to delivering difficult news, in a way that allowed listeners to absorb its full weight, without being overwhelmed by it all at once. He told her of the Veiled Wilds, a stretch of cursed borderland far to the north of even his own Frostmane territory, a place so thoroughly avoided by every pack in living memory that most young pups grew up believing it existed only in cautionary stories meant to frighten them into obedience. "The Veiled Wilds are real," Draven said, "and the danger sealed within them is real as well, though it has slept undisturbed for so many generations that most have forgotten to fear it properly. Long before any pack alive today existed, an ancient entity was bound within those lands by powerful wards, a creature capable of consuming entire packs whole, driven by a hunger that predates even the oldest wolf bloodlines currently ruling the northern territories." Arya listened in silence, her mind racing to absorb information that felt simultaneously impossible and, in some strange way she could not fully explain, entirely familiar, as though some quiet part of her had always known that her existence carried a purpose larger than anything Thornridge territory alone could offer her. "What kind of entity?" Arya asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The old texts describe it only in fragments," Draven admitted honestly, refusing to offer false certainty where none truly existed. "Some call it a devourer of packs, something ancient and hungry, that once roamed freely across the northern lands, until the combined strength of every wolf territory at the time managed to seal it away within the Veiled Wilds, using wards powerful enough to contain even its considerable strength. But wards, no matter how powerful, weaken over time if they are not properly maintained, and the knowledge required to maintain them properly has been lost for generations, forgotten alongside so much other ancient wisdom that once guided our ancestors. And you believe these wards are failing now?" Arya said, piecing together the implications of everything he had told her thus far. "I believe they are weaker than they have ever been," Draven confirmed. My own grandmother, who served as healer to Frostmane territory for decades before her passing, studied these old texts more thoroughly than anyone else I have known. She believed the wards would eventually fail entirely, and she believed the appearance of a raven born to wolves would signal that failure was approaching, since the prophecy states clearly that only such a creature possesses the unique nature required to safely enter the Veiled Wilds and address the threat contained within, before it can escape entirely and threaten every pack across the northern territories. Arya felt the weight of these words settle over her slowly, like snow accumulating on branches, until they bent under pressure they were never designed to bear. 16 years of feeling like an outsider among her own pack. 16 years of hiding her true nature, of watching her sister receive the warmth and acceptance she herself had always been denied. And now this stranger sat before her explaining that her entire existence had been shaped by forces far larger than anything she had ever imagined, that the very qualities which had made her an outcast among wolves might be exactly what the world needed to prevent a catastrophe none of them could otherwise survive. "Why me?" Arya asked quietly, the question carrying far more weight than its simple wording suggested. Why should I be the one responsible for confronting something this dangerous, simply because of how I happened to be born? Draven considered this question carefully before answering, understanding that whatever he said next would likely shape how Arya viewed her entire future from this point forward. "I cannot answer why fate chose you specifically," Draven said honestly. "I can only tell you what the old prophecy suggests, that a wolf-born raven carries a nature the ancient wards cannot properly categorize, neither fully wolf, whom the wards were designed to destroy, nor fully bird in the ordinary sense, but something unique that exists in the space between those two categories entirely. This uniqueness, according to the old texts, allows passage through the wards that would otherwise prove fatal to any wolf attempting the same journey. Whether that uniqueness was chosen deliberately by whatever force shaped this prophecy, or whether it simply happened to work out this way through pure chance, I honestly cannot tell you." Arya sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything she had heard, feeling the careful walls she had built around her own identity over 16 years beginning to shift and reshape themselves around this new understanding of who she truly was and what she might be capable of becoming. "What happens if I refuse?" Arya finally asked, needing to understand the full scope of her choice before she could begin considering what path she wanted to take. "Then nothing happens immediately," Draven answered honestly. "The wards may hold for another year, another decade, perhaps even longer, though my grandmother believed their failure was approaching more rapidly than most would assume, based on how slowly such things typically progress. If you refuse this path, I will not force you toward it, and I will not think less of you for choosing safety and a normal life over a dangerous mission with uncertain chances of success. But if the wards do fail eventually, and no other raven born to wolves exists to attempt what the prophecy describes, the consequences will likely fall upon every pack across the northern territories, including your own family, including everyone you have ever known and loved." The weight of this final statement settled heavily over the small gathering, Garrick shifting uncomfortably nearby as he listened to a conversation that would ultimately decide not just his daughter's future, but potentially the future safety of everyone within his territory. Arya felt the full crushing weight of this responsibility, pressing down on shoulders that had spent 16 years growing accustomed to carrying secrets, though nothing had ever felt quite this heavy before. "I need time to think," Arya said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. "This is not a decision I can make in a single evening, based on a single conversation with a stranger, regardless of how convincing his explanation might be." Draven nodded immediately, understanding and respecting the reasonable nature of her request. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I will remain in the area, staying at a respectful distance from your territory, unless invited closer, until you reach whatever decision feels right to you. This choice belongs entirely to you, and I will not pressure you toward any particular outcome, regardless of what I personally believe would be wisest given everything at stake." The conversation ended shortly after, Draven withdrawing to allow Arya the privacy she needed to process everything she had learned, while Garrick remained with his daughter, offering quiet support without attempting to influence her decision one way or the other, understanding the importance of allowing her this choice free from parental pressure, despite his own considerable fears about what path she might ultimately choose. Over the following days, Arya found herself returning frequently to the forbidden woods where she had first discovered the true freedom of her raven form, seeking solitude and clarity among the same trees that had witnessed her earliest flights. She thought constantly about everything Draven had told her, about the ancient entity sleeping within the veiled wilds, about wards weakening with each passing generation, about a prophecy that suddenly gave meaning and purpose to an existence she had spent 16 years viewing primarily as a burden rather than a gift. She spoke with Ren during this period as well, sharing everything she had learned with the sister who had defended and supported her throughout their childhood, despite the strange differences that had always separated them from full equality within the pack's eyes. Ren listened carefully, her expression shifting through concern and fear, before eventually settling into something closer to fierce determination. "You have always been meant for something larger than the rest of us understood," Ren said finally, taking her sister's hands in her own with the same protective intensity she had shown since childhood. "I do not want you to face danger, and I am terrified of what might happen if you choose this path. But I have watched you spend 16 years feeling like you did not belong here, like some essential part of yourself remained hidden and unexpressed. Perhaps this is not simply a danger you must face, but also the first true opportunity you have ever had to become fully yourself, without apology or careful concealment." These words stayed with Arya through the following nights, weighing against her fears about the unknown dangers awaiting her, against her reluctance to leave the only home she had ever known, against the quiet ache of uncertainty about whether she truly possessed whatever strength or skill the prophecy assumed she carried simply by virtue of her unusual birth. But beneath all these fears and uncertainties, something else had begun to take root as well. A quiet sense of purpose she had never before experienced. A feeling that perhaps her entire life, every moment of isolation, and every hidden flight above forbidden woods, had been preparing her for exactly this moment of choice. On the 7th day following Draven's arrival, Arya found him waiting patiently at the edge of Thornridge territory, exactly where he had promised to remain until she reached her decision. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding with the weight of what she was about to say, understanding that whatever answer she gave would irrevocably change the course of her entire future. "I will learn what you can teach me," Arya said finally, her voice steady, despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. "I do not know yet whether I possess the strength this prophecy requires, but I refuse to remain here, hiding what I truly am, while a danger this significant threatens everyone I love. Teach me what I need to know, and I will find out for myself whether I am truly capable of becoming what this prophecy claims I was always meant to be." Draven studied her for a long moment, something that might have been quiet admiration flickering behind his careful, composed expression, before he finally nodded in acknowledgement of her decision. "Then we begin immediately," Draven said. "There is no time to waste, and a great deal of ground to cover before you will be ready to face whatever waits within the veiled wilds." The training began the following morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, and it began with a lesson that surprised Arya far more than she expected. She had assumed, based on everything she understood about warrior training within her own pack, that Draven would start by teaching her to fight, to strike and defend, to move her body through the aggressive patterns she had watched Ren and other young warriors practice countless times over the years. Instead, Draven led her to a quiet clearing near the border between Thornridge and the neutral lands beyond, and asked her simply to shift into her raven form and hold perfectly still. "Watch everything," Draven instructed, his voice calm and patient, in a way that immediately put Arya at ease, despite her uncertainty about this unusual approach. "Tell me what you notice that you would never notice in your wolf-shaped skin." Arya shifted, feeling the familiar rush of darkening feathers and shrinking bones, and settled onto a low branch overlooking the clearing. At first, she struggled to understand what Draven wanted from her, but slowly, as she remained still and simply observed her surroundings, she began noticing details that had always escaped her attention before. The particular way wind moved differently at height than it moved along the ground. The subtle color variations in distant foliage that revealed hidden paths through dense undergrowth, invisible from a wolf's lower vantage point. The tiny movements of small creatures far below that would have gone entirely unnoticed by ground-bound eyes, but stood out with startling clarity from her elevated position. "This is your true strength," Draven explained once she had shifted back into her human form and shared everything she had observed. "Wolves fight with strength in numbers, overwhelming their enemies through raw physical power and coordinated pack tactics. But you possess something entirely different, a perspective no wolf could ever achieve, a way of seeing the world that reveals patterns and pathways, invisible to those who never leave the ground. Whatever waits within the veiled wilds, I do not believe you will defeat it through strength alone. You will need to understand it, to see what it cannot hide from a creature capable of viewing the world from angles it has never had to consider defending against. Over the following weeks, Draven's training methods continued to challenge Arya's assumptions about what preparation for this mission would actually require. He taught her to track subtle changes in wind and weather from her raven form, skills that would prove essential for navigating the unpredictable terrain of the veiled wilds, where ordinary landmarks might shift or disappear entirely, according to whatever ancient magic governed that cursed land. He taught her patience above all else, training her to remain motionless for hours at a time, observing without acting, understanding that impulsive action often led to far worse outcomes than careful, measured restraint. She also learned, gradually and sometimes painfully, to trust her own instincts in ways she had never been permitted to fully explore during her 16 years of careful concealment within Thornridge territory. Where before every impulse toward her raven nature had been something to suppress and hide, Draven encouraged her to explore these instincts fully, to understand the particular strengths her unusual nature provided, rather than viewing them as inconvenient deviations from proper wolf behavior. "You spent your whole life being told to hide what makes you different," Draven told her one evening, as they sat together reviewing the day's training beside a small fire at the edge of the Forbidden Woods. "But the very things you were taught to suppress may be exactly what saves every pack across these territories. There is no shame in being different, Arya. There is only opportunity, if you allow yourself to fully embrace what that difference truly offers." These conversations, shared quietly during the calm hours following each day's demanding training, gradually built something between Arya and Draven that neither of them had fully anticipated when their journey together first began. What started as a formal relationship between teacher and reluctant student slowly evolved into something warmer, built on mutual respect that deepened with each passing week. Draven found himself increasingly impressed by Arya's quick intelligence and her willingness to push past her own fears, despite the enormous pressure weighing on her shoulders. Arya, in turn, found herself drawn to Draven's patient wisdom and the quiet confidence he carried, so different from the careful, guarded distance she had grown accustomed to receiving from most people throughout her 16 years of life. Finn, who remained with the small Frostmane party throughout this training period, noticed the growing connection between his king and the young woman he had first spotted flying above the Forbidden Woods weeks earlier. He said nothing directly about his observations, understanding the delicacy of the situation and the importance of allowing whatever developed between them to unfold naturally, rather than being forced or rushed by outside commentary. But he watched with quiet interest as their formal training sessions began, including moments of genuine laughter, as their conversations extended longer into the evening hours than strictly necessary for practical instruction, as small gestures of consideration and care began appearing between them that suggested something deeper than simple professional respect. Ren also noticed these changes when she occasionally joined the training sessions to offer her own perspective on physical conditioning and basic combat techniques that complemented Draven's more unusual instruction methods. She teased her sister gently about the obvious warmth developing between Arya and the Northern King, though she also recognized the seriousness of what they were building together, understanding that whatever connection formed between them existed alongside the enormous weight of the mission ahead, rather than distracting from it entirely. "You seem happier than I have ever seen you," Ren observed one evening, watching her sister practice a particularly difficult aerial maneuver that Draven had been teaching her over the previous several days. "I am terrified nearly every moment," Arya admitted honestly, settling back into her human form after completing the exercise successfully. "But you are right that something feels different now. For the first time, I do not feel like I am hiding an essential part of myself. I feel like I am finally becoming exactly what I was always meant to become, even if I still do not fully understand what that means, or whether I will prove strong enough when the true test finally arrives." As the weeks progressed, Draven began incorporating more advanced instruction into their training regimen, teaching Arya about the specific nature of the Veiled Wilds, based on everything his grandmother had recorded in her careful studies of ancient texts before her passing. He explained the shifting, unreliable nature of the terrain within those cursed borders, the way paths might lead travelers in circles or disappear entirely without warning, the importance of relying on instinct and careful observation rather than conventional navigation once she crossed into that dangerous territory. He also taught her about the entity itself, sharing every fragment of information his grandmother had managed to gather from sources scattered across multiple generations of careful research. The creature, according to these fragments, fed not on physical flesh in the way ordinary predators consumed prey, but on something less tangible, drawing strength from fear and confusion. Growing more powerful, the more successfully it manipulated its victims into panic and disorientation, before finally destroying them entirely. This means composure will matter more than strength when you finally face it, Draven explained during one particularly serious evening conversation. If everything my grandmother recorded proves accurate, this entity feeds on the very fear it inspires in those who encounter it. Your greatest weapon against something like this will not be aggression or physical combat, but the same patience and careful observation you have already begun mastering through our training together. Whatever tricks or illusions it attempts to use against you, remain calm, trust your instincts, and remember that panic is precisely what it hopes to provoke. Burrito was cold, these lessons with growing confidence, though the fear underlying every conversation about the actual confrontation ahead never fully disappeared, no matter how much training and preparation she completed. She understood, on some fundamental level, that no amount of preparation could fully ready her for an encounter with something this ancient and unknown, that ultimately, when the moment finally arrived, she would need to rely on courage and instinct developed through weeks of careful training, rather than any guarantee of certain success. As autumn deepened toward winter, word of the training taking place near Thornridge Territory's border inevitably began spreading, despite everyone's careful efforts to maintain discretion about the true nature of what Arya and Draven were preparing for. Other pack leaders in the surrounding territories grew curious about the unusual alliance forming between Thornridge and Frostmane, curious about rumors of the young Alpha King spending extended time so far from his own lands, curious about whispered stories concerning a raven born to wolves that had somehow reached ears well beyond the borders where the secret had originally been so carefully guarded. This growing attention would eventually prove far more consequential than anyone involved in the training initially anticipated, drawing the notice of certain ambitious leaders among neighboring packs, who saw in the unusual alliance forming between Thornridge and Frostmane an opportunity to advance their own interests, regardless of the potential cost to the delicate preparations Arya and Draven had been so carefully building together throughout the passing weeks. But for now, within the quiet clearings near the Forbidden Woods, Arya continued her training, with growing confidence and determination, entirely unaware of the challenges about to emerge from unexpected directions, challenges that would test not just her physical preparation for the mission ahead, but her ability to maintain trust and unity among allies, whose loyalty she had begun to take for granted during these peaceful weeks of focused preparation. The rumors reached Callum, Alpha of the Greyfen territory, bordering the neutral lands to the east, roughly a month after Draven first arrived at Thornridge. Callum had never possessed Draven's patience or careful strategic thinking, ruling his own territory through a combination of intimidation and shifting alliances that had earned him more enemies than genuine friends among the surrounding packs. He had watched Frostmane's growing influence across the northern territories with increasing resentment for years, viewing Draven's careful network of scouts and informants as an unfair advantage that threatened Greyfen's own ambitions for expanded power and territory. When word reached him of a raven born to wolves, of Draven personally traveling south to train this unusual creature for some unspecified purpose, Callum recognized immediately an opportunity too valuable to ignore. If he could somehow discredit whatever alliance was forming between Thornridge and Frostmane, he might weaken Draven's growing influence significantly, perhaps even isolating Frostmane from potential allies at a moment when Callum's own ambitions for expanded territory required exactly this kind of strategic advantage. He began his campaign carefully, spreading carefully crafted rumors through trusted contacts in neighboring packs, rumors that twisted the truth of Arya's nature into something far more sinister than the reality Draven and Arya had been working so diligently to understand and prepare for. Where the truth involved an unusual young woman training to face an ancient threat for the benefit of every northern territory, Callum's version described a dangerous, unnatural creature that threatened the stability of proper wolf bloodlines everywhere, a monster masquerading as a young woman, secretly working alongside Frostmane's ambitious young king to gather power that would eventually be turned against every other territory in the region. These rumors spread with alarming speed, carried by traveling merchants and wandering pack members, who had no reason to question stories that arrived wrapped in enough concerning detail to sound plausible, particularly among packs already inclined toward suspicion regarding anything unusual or unexplained. Within weeks, whispers reached even Thornridge territory itself, causing uneasy murmurs among pack members, who had spent 16 years successfully keeping Arya's true nature secret, now suddenly confronted with distorted versions of that same secret circulating openly among neighboring territories. Garrick grew increasingly concerned as these rumors intensified, understanding the danger they posed not just to his daughter's reputation, but potentially to Thornridge's standing among its neighboring territories more broadly. He brought his concerns to Draven during one tense evening conversation, sharing reports of increasingly hostile whispers reaching his warriors from contacts in surrounding packs. "They are calling her a monster," Garrick said grimly, watching Draven's expression carefully for any sign of how seriously he took this developing threat. "Some are saying you plan to use her unnatural abilities to conquer neighboring territories once her training is complete. Others claim she has already been corrupted by whatever ancient darkness sleeps within the Veiled Wilds, that approaching that cursed land will only accelerate a transformation that will eventually turn her against everyone she once claimed to protect." Draven felt genuine anger rise within him at hearing these distortions of everything he and Arya had worked so carefully to build together, though he forced himself to remain composed, understanding that impulsive reaction would only worsen an already delicate situation. He had suspected, based on the particular pattern and timing of these rumors, that Callum's ambitions likely lay behind their sudden spread, though proving this connection definitively would require more evidence than he currently possessed. "These rumors are lies, deliberately crafted to weaken whatever alliance might form between our territories," Draven said firmly. "But lies spread quickly regardless of their falseness, and if we do not address them directly, they may cause damage that becomes increasingly difficult to repair, regardless of how much truth eventually emerges to contradict them." Arya, who had been present for much of this conversation, felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest, an echo of the isolation she had experienced throughout her childhood whenever pack members looked at her with suspicion and fear rather than acceptance. But something had changed within her over the preceding weeks of training and preparation, a growing confidence in her own worth and purpose that refused to accept these distorted rumors without challenge. "I will not hide from this," Arya said firmly, drawing surprised looks from both her father and Draven at the sudden determination in her voice. "I spent 16 years hiding what I am, allowing fear and secrecy to define how others perceived me. I refuse to let lies define me now, not when so much depends on the alliances we are trying to build. If people fear what I am, then I must show them the truth directly, rather than allowing rumors to speak for me while I remain safely hidden." This declaration led to considerable debate among Arya's small circle of allies regarding the wisest approach to countering Callum's spreading rumors. Some argued for continued discretion, for allowing time and eventual results to eventually disprove the false claims circulating through neighboring territories. Others, including Ren, argued strongly for a more direct approach, suggesting that Arya appear openly before representatives from surrounding packs, demonstrating her true nature and intentions honestly, rather than allowing suspicion to fester unchallenged. Eventually, after considerable discussion, a plan emerged that combined elements of both approaches. Draven would call for a gathering of pack leaders from across the surrounding territories, ostensibly to discuss matters of regional cooperation and shared concerns, but with the underlying purpose of allowing Arya to address the growing rumors directly, presenting the true nature of her situation and the genuine threat posed by the weakening wards around the Veiled Wilds, to an audience capable of spreading accurate information back to their own territories afterward. This gathering carried enormous risk. Appearing publicly before leaders from potentially hostile territories meant exposing Arya's true nature to a far wider audience than the careful secrecy maintained throughout her childhood had ever allowed, risking exactly the kind of exposure her parents had worked so hard to prevent for 16 years. But the alternative, allowing Callum's distorted rumors to continue spreading unchallenged, seemed increasingly likely to poison relations between territories, at precisely the moment when unity and cooperation would prove essential for confronting whatever threat truly waited within the Veiled Wilds. The gathering took place at a neutral location, roughly equidistant between the major territories of the region, a wide meadow, traditionally used for diplomatic meetings between pacts, that shared no direct alliance, but required occasional cooperation regarding matters of mutual concern. Leaders from a dozen different territories arrived over the following days, some curious about the unusual circumstances prompting this gathering, others openly skeptical or hostile based on the rumors that had already reached their own lands, and a few, including Callum himself, arriving with barely concealed satisfaction at the apparent success of his campaign to sow discord and suspicion. Arya felt her heart pounding as she prepared to address this gathering, understanding that the outcome of the following hours would likely determine not just her own reputation across the Northern Territories, but the success or failure of the entire mission she had committed herself to completing. Draven stood beside her as she prepared to speak, offering quiet reassurance, without attempting to speak for her, or diminish the importance of her own voice, in addressing these accumulated fears and distortions. "You do not need to convince everyone here," Draven told her quietly, as the assembled leaders settled into position awaiting her address. "You only need to speak the truth clearly and honestly. Those willing to listen with open minds will recognize that truth for what it is. Those determined to believe whatever serves their own ambitions will not be swayed regardless of what you say, and their opinion should not carry weight against the honest judgment of those genuinely willing to consider the evidence before them." Arya stepped forward before the assembled leaders, her heart racing but her voice steady, drawing on every lesson in patience and composure she had absorbed during her weeks of careful training. She spoke honestly about her birth, about the years of hiding her true nature, about the prophecy Draven had explained to her, and the genuine threat posed by the weakening wards protecting the Northern Territories from whatever ancient entity slept within the Veiled Wilds. She addressed the false rumors directly, without anger or defensiveness, simply presenting the truth clearly, and allowing her audience to weigh that truth against the distorted stories that had reached them through less reliable channels. The assembled leaders listened with varying degrees of skepticism and growing interest as her address continued, and when she finally demonstrated her raven shift openly before them, transforming smoothly from human form into a sleek black bird, and back again, without hesitation or apparent difficulty, a murmur of surprised acknowledgement swept through the gathering, many of the assembled leaders recognizing genuine sincerity in a demonstration that could not easily have been faked or exaggerated for dramatic effect. Callum, watching this demonstration with growing frustration, attempted to salvage his campaign of doubt by raising pointed questions about Arya's true loyalties and the ultimate purpose behind Frostmane's involvement in her training, suggesting that even if her unusual nature was genuine, this did not necessarily prove the absence of hidden ambitions behind the alliance forming between her and the Northern King. But his questions, delivered with barely concealed hostility, began to reveal more about his own motivations than about any genuine concern for regional safety, and several of the assembled leaders exchanged knowing glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the true source behind the rumors that had been spreading so persistently in recent weeks. By the time the gathering concluded, a majority of the assembled leaders had come away convinced of the genuine nature of the threat Arya and Draven described, agreeing to at least tentative cooperation should the situation within the Veiled Wilds develop as seriously as the old prophecy suggested it might. Callum departed the gathering visibly frustrated, his campaign of doubt largely unsuccessful in achieving the widespread damage he had hoped to inflict on the alliance between Thornridge and Frostmane, though his resentment toward both territories had clearly only deepened as a result of his public failure to convince the assembled leaders of his distorted version of events. Arya returned to her training in the following days feeling both exhausted and strengthened by the experience, having faced public scrutiny and hostile skepticism directly rather than hiding from it, as she might have done throughout most of her earlier life. The gathering had cost her something in terms of privacy and comfortable anonymity, but it had also given her something invaluable in return, a sense of confidence in her ability to face difficult challenges directly, to speak her own truth clearly regardless of the fear and uncertainty churning beneath the surface of her composed exterior. But Callum's resentment, though publicly unsuccessful in its immediate goals, did not simply disappear following his failed campaign of rumors. It settled instead into something quieter and more dangerous, a patient grudge that would wait for a better opportunity to manifest, an opportunity that would arrive far sooner than either Arya or Draven anticipated, threatening consequences far more serious than the spreading of false rumors and public doubt that had already tested their alliance so thoroughly during the preceding weeks. 3 months after the gathering at the Neutral Meadow, a messenger arrived at Thornridge territory in the middle of the night, exhausted and shaking, carrying news that shattered whatever fragile calm had settled over the preceding weeks of continued training and preparation. A section of the ancient wards surrounding the Veiled Wilds had collapsed entirely, according to reports reaching Frostmane's northern scouts, and strange disturbances had already begun spreading outward from the cursed borderland, affecting weather patterns and wildlife behavior across territories that bordered the Veiled Wilds directly. Draven received this news with the grim recognition of a fear finally realized after months of careful preparation and uncertain waiting. He immediately sent word to Arya, who arrived at his temporary quarters near the Thornridge border within minutes of receiving the summons, her expression already tight with the understanding that whatever calm preparation period they had shared together was rapidly drawing to its inevitable conclusion. "The wards have begun failing," Draven told her without preamble, understanding that Arya deserved honesty rather than careful diplomatic softening of news this significant. "My scouts report strange disturbances spreading from the borderland, animals fleeing territories they have inhabited for generations, unusual weather patterns that defy every natural explanation. Whatever sleeps within the Veiled Wilds is beginning to stir, and I believe we no longer have the luxury of extended preparation before you must attempt the crossing." Arya felt fear coil tightly in her chest at these words, months of training suddenly feeling insufficient against the weight of what she was about to attempt. But beneath that fear, she also felt something steadier, a conviction built through weeks of patient preparation, that she could not simply allow that fear to paralyze her when so much depended on swift and decisive action. "Then we should not delay," Arya said, her voice steadier than she expected given the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. "Every day we wait is another day the wards continue weakening further. If I am meant to attempt this crossing, better to attempt it now, while there is still time to prevent complete disaster, rather than waiting until the situation grows even more dangerous." Preparations moved quickly following this decision, a small party assembling to escort Arya as far as the boundary of the Veiled Wilds itself, understanding that beyond that point, according to everything Draven's grandmother had recorded in her careful studies, no wolf could safely follow regardless of their strength or determination. The journey north to the cursed borderland took nearly 2 weeks, traveling through increasingly unsettled terrain as they approached territories already beginning to experience the strange disturbances that had first alerted Frostmane's scouts to the failing wards. Ren insisted on accompanying the traveling party, despite the obvious dangers involved, refusing to allow her sister to face this journey without at least the comfort of familiar support, for as long as circumstances would permit. Garrick and Elena remained behind at Thornridge, understanding the importance of maintaining stability within their own territory during a period of significant uncertainty, though the pain of watching their daughter depart toward such an uncertain and dangerous fate weighed heavily on both of them throughout the following weeks. When the traveling party finally reached the boundary of the Veiled Wilds, the landscape before them confirmed every fear that had been building throughout their journey north. The trees here grew twisted and strange, their bark blackened as though scorched by some ancient fire long since extinguished, while an unnatural silence hung over the entire landscape, absent even the ordinary sounds of birds or small creatures that typically filled any forest environment. A faint, shimmering distortion marked the visible boundary of the ancient wards, weaker in places where sections had clearly already collapsed, still holding in others where the old magic maintained a fragile, uncertain integrity. "This is as far as any of us can safely travel," Draven said, studying the shimmering boundary with an expression that mixed grim determination with barely concealed fear for what Arya was about to attempt. "Beyond this point, the wards will destroy any wolf who attempts to cross, regardless of intention or preparation. From here forward, you must proceed alone." Arya studied the strange, distorted landscape stretching beyond the boundary, feeling the full weight of the moment finally settling over her. Months of training and preparation, culminating in this single, irreversible decision to step forward into danger no one could fully prepare her for, regardless of how thoroughly they had discussed and rehearsed every possible scenario during the preceding weeks. She turned to face Draven one final time before beginning her crossing, and something passed between them in that shared look that transcended the formal relationship of teacher and student they had begun with months earlier, something closer to the deep connection that had grown steadily throughout their weeks of careful training and honest conversation together. "Whatever happens beyond that boundary," Draven said quietly, his composed exterior finally cracking slightly to reveal the depth of genuine feeling he had carefully guarded throughout their time together. "Know that you have already proven yourself far stronger and more capable than anyone, myself included, could have reasonably hoped for when this journey first began. Whatever waits for you in there, I believe with everything I have that you possess exactly what is needed to face it successfully." Arya felt tears threaten at the corner of her eyes, quickly blinked away as she gathered every ounce of courage she had built throughout her months of preparation, understanding that the moment for hesitation had finally passed entirely. "I will return," Arya said firmly, though she could not fully guarantee the truth of this promise, given everything uncertain about what waited beyond the boundary before her. "Wait for me here, and I will find my way back to you, whatever it takes." She shifted into her raven form, feeling the familiar rush of darkening feathers and shrinking bones settle over her body one final time before the true test of everything she had learned, and without allowing herself further hesitation, she launched herself into the air and flew directly toward the shimmering boundary marking the edge of the Veiled Wilds. The moment she crossed through the ancient wards, Arya felt a strange sensation ripple through her entire body, as though the boundary itself was testing and evaluating her nature, searching for the wolf blood that would trigger destruction, finding instead something it could not properly categorize, something that slipped through its defenses precisely because it existed in the careful space between categories the wards had been designed to recognize. She passed through entirely unharmed, emerging into the cursed landscape beyond, with her heart pounding, but her body intact, exactly as the old prophecy had promised. The Veiled Wilds stretched before her in unsettling silence, the twisted trees here, even more distorted than those near the boundary, the air itself carrying a strange, heavy quality that made every breath feel deliberate and effortful. Arya flew forward carefully, applying every lesson in patient observation that Draven had taught her during their months of training together, watching for any sign of the ancient entity that supposedly slept somewhere within this cursed territory, waiting for the moment when the true test of everything she had learned would finally arrive. She did not have to wait long. As she passed over a particularly dense section of twisted forest, the ground below her seemed to shift and ripple, as though the landscape itself was responding to her presence, and a low, resonant sound began building somewhere beneath the earth, a sound that seemed to press directly against her bones rather than simply reaching her ears through ordinary hearing. Arya felt fear rise sharply within her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, remembering everything Draven had taught her about the nature of this entity, about its hunger for fear and confusion, about the importance of composure over panic when the true confrontation finally began. The forest below her seemed to darken further, shadows deepening and shifting, in ways that defied the actual position of whatever light still filtered down from the overcast sky above. And slowly, from somewhere within that gathering darkness, something began to take shape, vast and ancient, its exact form difficult to discern clearly, even as Arya's sharp raven vision strained to understand what she was truly witnessing for the first time. Whatever slept within the Veiled Wilds had finally begun to wake, and Arya understood, with absolute clarity, that everything she had trained for during the preceding months was about to be tested in ways no amount of preparation could have fully anticipated. The shape rising from the darkened forest floor seemed to shift and change with every passing moment, never settling fully into a form Arya's eyes could properly categorize, sometimes appearing vaguely wolf-shaped, sometimes stretching into something closer to shadow, given rough physical presence, always accompanied by that same low, bone-deep resonance that seemed designed to unsettle and disorient anyone unfortunate enough to encounter it directly. A voice emerged from the shifting darkness, ancient and cold, carrying words that seemed to form directly inside Arya's mind, rather than through any ordinary means of hearing. "Little bird," the voice said, dripping with something between amusement and hunger. "So few have dared approach me in all the long years of my sleep. Tell me, do you come seeking to destroy me, or merely to satisfy your own foolish curiosity, before I consume whatever courage brought you here in the first place?" Arya remained perched carefully on a nearby branch, forcing herself to breathe slowly and steadily, despite the fear this ancient voice inspired deep within her chest, drawing on every lesson in patience and composure Draven had taught her throughout their months of careful preparation together. "I come because your wards are failing," Arya said, her mental voice steadier than she expected given the terror coiling through her body. "I come to understand what threat you truly pose, and to determine whether there remains any path toward preventing the destruction the old prophecies warn will follow if you are allowed to wake fully and escape this borderland entirely." The shifting darkness seemed to pulse with something like amusement at her response, the resonant voice deepening further as it continued speaking. "You believe understanding alone will save your precious packs, little bird. I have consumed the fear of countless creatures who believed themselves prepared to face me, drawing strength from their panic, long before I ever needed to lift a single claw against them. Your composure is admirable, but composure alone will not be enough to prevent what is already beginning." Arya felt the entity's words probing at her carefully constructed calm, searching for cracks in her composure it could exploit and widen, exactly as Draven had warned her it would attempt. She thought of everything she had learned during her months of training, of the patient observation that had always been her true strength, rather than the aggressive confrontation a wolf might have instinctively chosen instead. She studied the shifting darkness more carefully, applying the same careful observation skills Draven had spent months teaching her, looking beyond the surface intimidation the entity clearly intended to project, searching instead for whatever true nature lay beneath that carefully cultivated fear. Slowly, as she watched patiently, rather than reacting with the panic the entity clearly expected, she began noticing something significant, a subtle inconsistency in the way the shifting shadows moved, a pattern that suggested the entity's vast and intimidating presence might be less substantial than it appeared, more illusion and manipulation than genuine overwhelming power. "You feed on fear because you need it," Arya said slowly, understanding dawning as she spoke the words aloud. "Not simply because you enjoy it, but because you require it to maintain whatever strength you currently possess. The wards weakened your prison, but they did not restore your full power. You remain trapped in a diminished state, relying entirely on the fear of those foolish enough to approach you directly, in order to grow strong enough to eventually break free completely." The shifting darkness seemed to pulse with sudden agitation at this observation, the low, resonant voice sharpening with something closer to genuine anger than the amused condescension it had displayed throughout their conversation thus far. "Clever little bird," the voice hissed, though the words carried less confident menace than before. "Understanding my nature will not save you. I have consumed braver creatures than you, and I will consume you as well, regardless of whatever clever observations you believe you have made." But Arya, drawing on the composure she had spent months carefully cultivating, refused to allow this renewed threat to shake her growing confidence. If this ancient entity truly required fear to maintain and grow its power, then the solution to preventing its escape was not aggressive confrontation or physical combat, qualities a wolf might have instinctively relied upon, but something entirely different, something only her unique nature as a creature, caught between wolf and bird, might allow her to properly execute. She began to sing. It was not a song with words, not something she had practiced or planned during her months of preparation, but something that emerged instinctively from deep within her raven nature, a clear, resonant call, unlike anything a wolf could ever produce, carrying a quality of calm and steady confidence that pushed back directly against the fear and confusion the ancient entity depended upon for its strength. The sound filled the twisted forest around her, clean and unwavering, refusing to be drowned out by the entity's attempts to project intimidation and terror. The shifting darkness seemed to falter as her song continued, the vast, ill-defined shape growing less certain, less substantial, as though the very confidence and calm Arya projected through her raven call was directly undermining whatever power the entity had managed to accumulate through centuries of feeding on the fear of previous encounters. The ancient voice grew increasingly desperate, alternating between threats and pleading as its form continued destabilizing under the steady pressure of Arya's unwavering composure. "You cannot simply refuse to fear me," the voice snarled, though it carried unmistakable panic beneath its anger now. "Fear is instinct. Fear is what every creature feels when facing true danger. Perhaps ordinary creatures feel only fear when facing danger," Arya responded, her song never faltering despite the entity's mounting desperation. "But I was never entirely ordinary. I spent 16 years learning to sit quietly with fear and confusion, without allowing either to control my actions. You may feed on panic and terror, but I have spent my entire life learning to master exactly those feelings, rather than being mastered by them." The ancient entity's form continued weakening as her steady song filled the twisted forest, until finally, with a final desperate surge of resistance that produced nothing more than a fading whisper of its former intimidating presence, the shifting darkness collapsed entirely back into the earth from which it had first emerged, sinking back into whatever deep slumber the ancient wards had originally been designed to maintain, though weakened now in a manner that suggested this particular threat would remain dormant for considerably longer than the failing wards alone might have guaranteed. Arya remained perched on her branch for a long moment afterward, her raven heart still pounding rapidly, hardly able to believe that the confrontation she had trained for across so many difficult months had concluded not through combat or physical struggle, but through the simple, steady application of composure and understanding, qualities that had always been her true strength even during the years when she had felt most like an outcast among her own pack. She flew back toward the boundary of the Veiled Wilds slowly, exhaustion settling over her in waves, now that the immediate danger had finally passed, and when she finally crossed back through the shimmering wards into the ordinary world beyond, she found Draven waiting exactly where she had left him, his expression a complex mixture of relief and barely restrained emotion that he had clearly struggled to contain throughout every moment of her absence. She shifted back into her human form the moment she landed, and Draven closed the distance between them immediately, his careful composure finally breaking entirely as he pulled her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed about the depth of feeling he had developed for her throughout their months together. "You succeeded," Draven said, his voice thick with emotion, as he finally pulled back enough to study her face carefully, searching for any sign of injury or lasting harm from her encounter within the cursed borderland. "I did not defeat it through strength," Arya told him, still catching her breath from the lingering adrenaline of her encounter. "I defeated it by refusing to become what it needed me to become, by remaining exactly myself, rather than allowing fear to change who I was." Ren rushed forward as well, embracing her sister fiercely, tears of relief streaming freely down her face, as she finally allowed herself to fully feel the terror she had carefully suppressed throughout the long hours of waiting near the boundary. The rest of the traveling party gathered around as well, offering quiet congratulations and expressions of profound relief that the dangerous mission had concluded successfully, though the full significance of what Arya had accomplished would take considerably longer to fully spread and be understood across the broader northern territories. News of Arya's successful confrontation within the Veiled Wilds spread quickly over the following weeks, carried by the same networks of scouts and messengers that had originally brought word of her existence to Draven's attention months earlier. The rumors Callum had once spread, painting her as a dangerous and unnatural threat, were thoroughly overshadowed by the true story of her courage and sacrifice, a story that transformed public perception across nearly every territory that had once viewed her unusual nature with suspicion and fear. Thornridge and Frostmane, having worked together so closely throughout the months of preparation and crisis, found their alliance strengthened considerably by everything they had accomplished together, an alliance that would eventually be formalized through a bond between their two ruling families that surprised almost no one who had witnessed the growing connection between Arya and Draven throughout their months of shared purpose and mutual respect. Arya returned to Thornridge territory not as the quiet, isolated girl who had once stood at the edges of every gathering, watched with careful suspicion by pack members uncertain how to categorize her strange nature, but as someone whose courage and sacrifice had become known and celebrated across nearly every territory in the northern lands. The little girl who had once felt fundamentally out of place among wolves had finally found not just acceptance, but genuine honor, earned through embracing, rather than hiding, the very qualities that had once made her feel so different from everyone around her. In the years that followed, as Arya and Draven built their life together bridging the territories of Thornridge and Frostmane, the old prophecy that had once felt like a heavy burden placed upon an innocent child gradually transformed, in the retelling passed down through subsequent generations, into something closer to a promise fulfilled, a reminder that difference and uniqueness, rather than representing weakness or danger, often carried within them exactly the strength needed to face challenges that more conventional strength alone could never have properly addressed. The girl born wrong among wolves had become, in the end, precisely what her entire world had needed her to be. Wings and fur finally united, not through forced transformation, but through the simple, hard-won wisdom of learning to fully embrace exactly who she had always truly been.